The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, and help me welcome the Honorable Bill O'Brien, past Speaker of the House and now candidate for the Federal Senate.
Yeah.
Bill, how's this going?
Oh, thank you for having me here, Carl. It's always a pleasure to come in and talk with you.
Well, it must be interesting this last week, even comparing what happened in Concord to what you did in 2011.
Well, we had kind of the mirror image of what we had when we were together in the majority in the House. There we had a strong conservative majority, and we came out with a great budget. And just as with Governor Sununu in looking at the Democrats' budget of overspending, the governor then didn't like it. Governor Lynch didn't like it. And yet he was a little bit less courageous than Governor Sununu. He didn't choose to sign it. He didn't choose to veto it. He just let it become law, as the Constitution provides if the governor doesn't weigh in. And it was a budget that, as you will recall, that put the fiscal House of New Hampshire in order. You know,
That's right.
We eliminated one particular obnoxious tax. That was a motor vehicle surcharge, registration surcharge, $90 million a year. They put that in place. Even putting that in place, they were running around $800 million deficit. We eliminated that deficit. We lived within our means. We got rid of that motor vehicle registration surcharge, as we promised people we would do. And I'm not sure if you remember, but we also eliminated 11 or 12 other taxes because that's what it took. Only now with this latest budget that was signed, and it was a compromise budget because in the end, when you have divided government such as we have, you have to compromise. But only now are we catching up to where the Democrats and the leftists were trying to put us back around 8 years ago. So I'm very pleased to see what Governor Sununu and House Republicans and Senate Republicans in Concord have done. They've done a good job for the people of New Hampshire.
Well, I think he copied a few of the things you did. Like I remember you saying, this is the money we have, guys. That's what it's going to be.
Right.
And we're going to limit it. And they got rid of some of the ones that were supposed to be continuing budget items, and it's only one-time shots at extra money.
You know, Carl, and I know I've said this to you before, when I realized I was a Republican, because I grew up as an adult, into my adulthood, like a lot of folks. I had a young family. I was working real hard, 60, 80 hours a week to better ourselves. And eventually I came to the point where I had a chance to participate in public service, and I went on a school board and thought what I was doing was just common sense. And so the local newspaper in our area started calling me that conservative Republican Bill O'Brien. And so often what others define as being conservative is just common sense. And when I was Speaker, we did something that I thought was common sense and ended up attracting national attention. I figured the first thing you do before you put together a budget is figure out how much money you have. And, I don't know.
It's sort of obvious to me.
Yeah, it's sort of obvious. If my wife and I are sitting around at the beginning of a year thinking, what's this year going to be like, and can we take a vacation someplace? We don't say, we want to go to Europe, we want to go to Disney World, and we're going to hit the West Coast while we're at it, and make all those plans and make all those commitments and go, oh, where's the money coming from?
Yeah, right.
And what you do is you say, what's the next year look like in terms of our income? What can we afford to do? And you might choose one of those, you might choose all of them, you might have to choose none of them, but you make that choice. That's what we did. We first went to the committee that figured out how much money was coming in, and they gave us a real rock solid estimates. And so then we went to this is sort of unusual. We went to our colleagues in the House. We put a resolution in through the Rules Committee and then onto the House floor. And that resolution said something very simple. We won't spend more money than we have. And it made budgeting certainly not easy, but it made it much more straightforward and the conversations much more realistic. You know, I'd have agency heads come into me, the commissioners and all, and they'd say, "Oh, what we're doing is so important." I said, "Well, I hope it is, yeah, but we don't have so much money for you." "Oh no, you have to have more money for you." "Well, you go talk to either the guy that just left before you or the young lady sitting out on the bench there, because they're going to tell me the same thing. So if yours is so important, tell her to reduce her budget 20% so you can keep the money you have, and you don't have to reduce yours 10%. And it made a realistic budget
You
discussion.
think you'll be successful in the federal government?
I think we can, because there's simple rules that apply there. You know, when I go out and talk to voters and I talk to activists in my party, one of the things I always talk about, because it's very, very important, is we have a budget deficit that before the latest budget was put in place was $22 trillion. And the latest budget is going to put it north of $23 trillion. Let's try to understand that. Billions, millions, trillions. That's $70,000 for every person who lives in the United States, legal or illegal. And that's not sustainable. That really isn't sustainable. But the solutions are straightforward. We can't do, because we'd had fiscal responsibility for so long before the 4 years of Democrats controlling the government before I became Speaker. So it didn't take a lot to rectify. I think you can only do so much damage in 4 years. Now we've had 70 or 80 years of Washington politicians, and certainly the Democrats, but I must say some folks in my own party, spending way beyond our means. And so it's going to take time for us to take the journey back to fiscal responsibility, but we can do it quicker than you think. If we work 6 or 8 budgets, 6 or 8 years, and say we're not going to increase spending, we're going to look for opportunities such as getting rid of the Department of Education to actually reduce spending, then tax receipts will catch up. And you know what that means, Carl? That means we can give our kids and their kids and generations unborn back their future, because we're doing something highly immoral. And you remember when we were in the House, I talked about this. The Democrats, for the first time, had borrowed money to pay for the government we want today. They basically floated bonds, not to build buildings. That's okay. You use a building 50 or 60 years, or a bridge 50 or 60 years, and you pay off the bond over that time period, hopefully less. And that's an investment. Saying that I want to spend more money on folks today and it's going to go away is not an investment. What it is just spending, and they borrowed money to do that. And so we reverse that. But in Washington, we've been doing that for years. And we have to stop. And it is not just bad fiscal policy, it's immoral. It truly is.
And they rush into the budgets that they're putting forward too.
I look at my little, I had 2 grandsons born this year, my first grandsons, and I look at them, and so they're 6 months, almost a year old in one case, and I look at them and I say, we're going to be telling their children to pay off the debts that we're incurring today.
Or their grandchildren.
And maybe even their grandchildren. It has to stop. And we can stop it. We can give them back their future. And the way we do it is with the same common sense discussions that we engaged in, and we reached out to others who maybe don't care as much about this issue, and say, care about it, here's the solution. We can do it in Washington. Being a senator, we're dedicated to a cause, and knowing others are down there dedicated to the same cause. Ted Cruz, who just endorsed me, I know is, and others. We can work the change that has to be achieved.
Well, one thing that always bothered me in the past, the only time I remember anybody starting to pay off a debt was around the end of the last century.
When Newt
Gingrich was in, and they started really doing what you said about having a budget that we could live with, and actually making money to pay off some of the debt. And then some reason it stopped. It didn't pay, after it stopped, after they paid a good chunk of it, but all of a sudden it reversed. And now they haven't paid off any in at least 20 years.
And so that's why there's a two-part solution. I talked about one part of it. And one part of it is being fiscally responsible, looking at that bottom line and saying we have to spend within our means. We have to get that spending line flat, and the tax receipts will intersect it. But then we have to have fundamental change on what we expect the federal government to do. I know you do. I consider myself a constitutionalist. I look at the federal constitution and I look at the things that it's doing, the federal government today is doing. It goes way beyond the mandate that our founders understood was the proper check and balance between the states and the federal government. We don't need a Department of Education. Have things got better in education since we have a federal Department of Education? I don't think so. In many ways, they have wrecked our schools. They've made them into not places of education, but places of virtue signaling. And you look at our colleges who responded to the Obama administration's Title IX directive to not provide due process for folks who are charged with assault. And they've taken that and they've made it into places where you have a uniform set of beliefs and no one's challenging it. I remember when I went to college and I came across some people that I thought were truly over the top. You'd come across some people who were militantly leftists, or people who thought the United States' role in the world was the worst any country's ever been. And you'd sit there and you'd debate them. What we didn't do is say, we're going to kick you out of here because you don't have my belief. And we're going to report you to the conduct committee and all. Yeah, and that's what college does. It causes you to be it should cause you to be challenged, think through your ideas, learn how to articulate what your ideas are, learn how to be a prepared citizen, not just for earning money, but that you have to earn a living, but also to participate in the public process. We're not doing that with our kids anymore. I mean, you look at the event recently that you and I were just talking about before we went on air. This young lady who went before the UN. Have you ever come across anyone more frightened by the leftist rhetoric and more propagandized than this young lady? I mean, my heart went out to her as I listened to her, because she's at the 16 years old. Her life should be full of joy, and the possibilities and all. And she doesn't realize that the 16 years of her life have been the best 16 years of humanity in terms of prosperity that's come across the world, and the fact that there's no huge conflicts in the world, the medical advances, and a lot of which is a result of fossil fuel, and the availability of electricity and all that. And yet she's so unhappy. Her 16 years are the best, just like the next 16 years, the progress we're making are going to be the best years of humanity. We're on a trajectory to living lives now that are great and being passed on to our children great, and yet they've propagandized us, and they do it for no other reason than to gain control of the lever of government.
That they know better and they can make a better deal for your future.
Yeah.
But you don't have any input to that.
Yeah, and you're not supposed to ask what's the reality of her presence here. For example, like the Monaco royal family provided her the yacht to come over. A yacht worth, as you would expect, millions of dollars. She's on it. They sailed over. She said, "Oh, she flies." She had to be on a ship. Thereafter, they flew the whole crew over to get the darn ship and all. But I looked at her and I thought, it's so sad, young lady. It really is.
Well, they frighten them at school too. I mean, you talk about the Department of Education. Well, local areas, they don't, do it as a matter of safety, but it's really to get guns under control. It's scaring everybody. So how are you going to do it? You do it by what they're going to control everything. That's not the way to do it. That's the way you go into
we certainly are appalled by the instances of mass shooting. But we have to understand, one, despite what the media says, they're less frequent than they had been in the past. That's one. And two, they have cause other than the fact that people have a right to arm themselves for self-protection. They have to do with mental health. We, in response to initiatives in the 60s and 70s, abandoned the effort to have institutional care of people who are really a danger to themselves and others. We looked at films. I don't know if you remember, there was a film called Tiddicate Follies. It was about the Bridgewater State Hospital. And this filmmaker went in there, and the situation was awful. The proper response would have been, that's an awful situation. We got to do better by these citizens by having institutions that are well funded and have compassionate people. But we have to have better care. It's not a matter of identifying people. We know who they are. The young lad in Sandy Hook was a very, very troubled young man, and he acted out the horrors in his life by doing something horrible. That's one change. Another change is that we have to make sure that we aren't providing an invitation to people who want the notoriety of going into a place and shooting up a lot of folks. In some instances, I'm convinced that what I read is true, that they're committing suicide by mass murder. And so we ought to, if anyone, I respect private property, but if anyone wants to maintain private property and say, don't bring your guns on, that's fully their right. But if they're going to invite the public in, then they have to provide armed protection, so it's not a free fire zone. Similar to our government buildings and our schools and so forth, we ought to encourage, not mandate, teachers to arm themselves. I recall, for example, around the time of Sandy Hook, I think it was, not Sandy Hook, the Virginia Tech shooting, about that same time where this young person came, and a troubled student, shot up people. There was an attempted mass shooting at a law school in West Virginia, I think it is, called Appalachian Law School. And some students, similar troubled, the pressures of school and all, came in and started shooting. And a professor went out and got his gun in his car and shot him. Ended it right there. Understanding that will happen will keep down the incidence of it.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that has to happen is we have to stop glorifying these people. Thoreau said in talking about news and all that, one of the things that we always have to keep in mind as newspapers and so forth in his time try to get us excited and to buy them and more newspapers and all, is that once you've understood the principle, each application of it doesn't add much to the common knowledge. And his example is, once you know that a house that catches on fire burns down, you don't need to know of every house that catches on fire and burns down. It's in his case, it was a distraction from what he thought were the truths of life. In our case, it is glorifying aberrant behavior and providing an incentive for those, going back to the first thing, those who are mentally challenged to act out their demons.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact, though, is that we're doing things more to look at people with mental problems. I think the state has finally made some moves that I think are very appropriate. Hopefully that'll solve problems because, well, we had things like mental health beds were in the state prison. That wasn't a very bright thing. I mean, you'd have to do it for criminals, but not every mental problem is a criminal problem. And the fact that they're looking into it a little bit more from support, mental health support on the local facilities, which I think is much needed, because a lot of things can be handled just on a local basis, but you do need some places where the people have to be under care constantly 24 hours a day.
You do, and it in part is to protect society, but it also is a measure of our compassion, because
Right.
it's kindness for individuals. I mean, we've all who suffer from these problems. We've all gone into cities. I remember when I was up in Concord and in Manchester, and now they have a problem with people who are addicted to chemicals, drugs, have mental illness, and you look at those folks and you realize they don't have any option but to be on the street. And this idea that we can give them medication that will calm them down, we know now that medication isn't taken, often isn't taken, because someone who is mentally ill doesn't want to be dulled by the medication. So you really have to be compassionate, hopefully work them back to mental health. But if not, put them in a setting that is well-funded, kind, clean, but compassionate.
And as they grow older, their medication changes too, and that's when you sometimes run into problems,
Right.
where the reaction is negative rather than positive.
Yeah, and you're given an opportunity to work with the person.
Right.
I'm enough of a libertarian, and I certainly prize human rights, that it's not an easy thing to do. It shouldn't be something that is not done without the utmost of due process. But there comes a time when people have to be cared for. I can remember I used to have my law office across from the State House in my first few years when I was in the legislature, trying still to earn a living. And I would see these folks on the sidewalk there and all. They were just troubled individuals and wandering aimlessly throughout up and down the streets. And some cases they'd be acting out, scaring people. And this is little old Concord, 40,000 people and all.
And I was just going to say, the smaller towns have a problem, but boy, you get to the larger ones. Yeah. I visited L.A. In the last several years a couple times, and it's just atrocious there.
What a failure of government there.
Yeah.
It's an absolute failure.
Right.
Somebody you mentioned to me, and I think it is true because I think I've seen it other places, that a third of the homeless people in the country now live in California.
Really?
Yeah, it's a real high percentage, and it's because they don't. They haven't been funding their institutions, and they don't enforce laws that tend to take those troubled people off the street. People relieving themselves in public and so forth. There's laws against that. People taking up residence in a public area or a park or a sidewalk. No, there's laws. That's for everyone's use. It's not your free home. And those are laws that we used in kindness in the past. In order to bring those people in for care. And so I think that's part of the gun issue here. I don't discount the concern of good people over gun violence, but they're looking at the instrument and not the perpetrator.
Right.
And in the meantime, we have thankfully, we have a strong Second Amendment, and I firmly believe that we not only have to protect that, but we have to extend it. If I go down to Washington, one of the things I'm going to be looking at is how do we get a national carry right? If you have a right to carry in one state, why don't you have it in all states? We don't say, look, you have the right of free speech in New Hampshire, but go out to California and you don't have it. At least we shouldn't be saying that.
You got to worry. We're in California.
You have to worry. Yeah, you have to worry. But these Bill of Rights, the rights in the first 10 amendments, are not geographically limited, and we that's one area that I think the federal government should act to make sure that those rights are universal within our country.
So when you get into the Senate, do you think you have a lot of jobs to convince the Department of Justice or whoever it is, FBI, that they have straightened out? They're not handling their job correctly?
It's been appalling, hasn't it? It's actually been appalling. I've been a great admirer of the efforts of the FBI over the year, fighting organized crime, and I am just really concerned about what has happened there. I think it might actually have to do with corruption that was introduced during the Obama administration. One of the things I heard recently was that James Comey, for example, when he was first being interviewed for a government job, U.S. attorney, very senior position actually, admitted that his background was that of a communist. And John Brennan, head of the CIA, admitted his first votes for president were for the communist candidate. I think what happened over the 8 years of Obama, that sort of corruption at the top has permeated down, not to the rank and file, they're good people, but certainly within the top leadership. So we have a long ways to go. And we have to start back. If we have our law enforcement agencies, and in particular the premier law enforcement agency in the country, corrupted, it's very, very frightening. And I think as we sit here during this week, where the House Judiciary Committee is, and now Nancy Pelosi is heading off on a more tracked method to impeachment, and it all comes because someone in the CIA called himself a whistleblower, although he only had hearsay knowledge of what he was blowing the whistle about. We realize that it's not going to just take one term of Donald Trump. It's going to take a strong Republican Congress. It's going to take a second term of Donald Trump, and it's going to take a terms of Republican presidents after that to bring us back to
where we belong.
Where we belong. Where we belong is a limited government, a small federal government, and a government that's respectful of our Constitution.
And that gives us choices that we deserve to be able to make ourselves rather than have it made for us.
We're adults. We're adults, and that's what our founders realized. We can take care of ourselves.
And we're responsible people.
No one's going to take better care of Carl Siddell than Carl Siddell, and that's the way it should be.
That's right.
And if we all take care of ourselves, then we don't need a big government.
Bill, we're finished for today, but let's make it a deal that we come back at least once a month and talk about things.
I'd love to do that.
And we got a lot to do. We got a lot to talk about, and hopefully the people are listening a little bit.
Yeah, never enough time. Thank you, Carl.
Okay, thank you.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.